Our next storyteller is a very dear friend of mine, a very old friend of mine who I know from another world, the world of comedy. This is the first time she's come on stage to tell a true story from her life. Please make welcome in a very special way a very special friend of mine, Yvette Murray.
Thanks for that ending there. That was lovely. I'm going to talk about my father who passed away a few years ago. Sorry, I was surprised to get emotional about this, but you kind of do still. My father was Terry Murray. He was an absent father. He was in and out of my life most of my life. He had a lot of issues with addiction, mainly alcoholism. When he died, we hadn't spoken for 12 years. There's a lot of stories about my father. Most of them are dodgy, cost-cutting stories where he would do things the easy way or the lazy way. And most of them at the beginning of the story are my memories. And the ones closer to the end are the stories my mother's told me with a bit of ad-lib because it's storytelling. We grew up in Summerhill. We grew up in a very run-down house. And my dad wouldn't do things because it was just too hard, like pay the bills. So when the phone got cut off or the gas got cut off, Dad would say, "Don't tell Mum." There's no hot water, Dad. So we'd boil water to have a bath, which is so Victorian Australia. He wouldn't fix the roof. So when the rain would come, the light fittings would leak and there'd be saucepans underneath them to catch the drips. When it really rained, the laundry would flood and we'd have to wear gumboots to go to the toilet. He went to paint the house. He painted it in an undercoat of orange and just didn't paint it again for 10 years. So for 10 years, people were like, oh, that's an interesting colour for a house. He went into business with my mum's brother Nick, painting houses. And his licence ran out, so he borrowed Nick's without telling him. So Nick took him to court. And Nick didn't speak to us for over 20 years because apparently dodginess is genetic. And in our family it may well be, because the story I'll tell you later on is a story about my father and his father committing a sin together. Now, my father Terry grew up in Woolloomooloo and he was an unplanned baby. My grandparents had him in their 40s, so I remember my grandparents as elderly people. Now, my grandmother Emmy, I loved her. I really did. I have a soft spot for her even now. She had the same bob haircut the whole life and she used to dye her hair black till her dying days. She had the funniest laugh. It was this laugh. So even though she had selective hearing, she'd hear some things go she used to pat her hair like this and she'd do the grandmother wave when we were leaving. You could see it for miles around. My grandfather Harry, he wasn't very paternal. He was an engineer and helped build Warragamba Dam. And he wore shorts and long socks, white short sleeve shirts, Buddy Holly glasses. My father Terry, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He was always reminiscent to me of Paul McCartney. He had a baby face and dark hair and was slender. He would actually play their songs on guitar on Sunday afternoons. And when my dad found something really funny, he would laugh like Muttley and his whole body would shake. And I remember when we went to see Crocodile Dundee, and I don't know if you remember the bit where the kangaroo pops up with the gun. Dad found that hilarious, so funny. And the whole cinema was laughing at my dad. It was so embarrassing. He was brought up Catholic but loved the supernatural, so he had all these books on voodoo and strange powers. I was like, oh my God, my dad's into the devil. It was all very, very mysterious. So my mum used to see my dad on the train going to school, and my dad was always a little bit different. He'd have a beret on. He was a little bit quirky and very artistic, and he was just really talented in so many ways. When she first married Dad, she lived with him on Charles Street in Woolloomooloo. Now back then, Woolloomooloo was a slum. It was a slum. And my dad actually grew up on the streets of Woolloomooloo and was a street kid, so this could account for the story I'll tell you later. My mum said it was very run down, and one time there was a fire in a house nearby and the rats came. The rats came tearing up the street into everything, and she tore the sheets back on the bed and there were rats in the bed. It was terrible. There was a lot of brothel action down there. Mum said that she'd go out and clean the condoms from the backyard because the sailors, when they're on shore leave, would throw them over the fence. There was one time there was a naked sailor coming running out of a brothel going, "Hey baby, give me my pants back." There was an old lady who lived across the road, and she was an elderly prostitute. She was elderly, and these old men would constantly go in and come and go out again. She used to hurl abuse at people, which was apparently "you pig woman" or something. She was just awful. So the story I'm going to tell you is the one my mum's told me, and it's about my grandfather Harry and my dad Terry, and they could have become very famous for all the wrong reasons because of this story. Now, I told you about cutting corners. Well, my grandfather said to my dad one day he wanted to dispose of some rubbish, but he didn't want to spend money taking it to the tip. So he said, let's go and dump it illegally somewhere. So they shoved the car full of rubbish, drove for 2 hours to Lane Cove National Park to save some money. Drove into the park, stood by the bridge and threw it over the bridge and drove home. Meanwhile, there'd been a murder. Thank you. Thank you, that was good. 2 murders, in fact. Thank you. Round of applause, that was good. Thank you. Now, these murders have become very famous. They're actually one of the most famous cases in Australian history. It's as big as Azaria Chamberlain's case. It was the Bogle and Chandler case. Now, Dr. Gilbert Bogle was a scientist working for the government, and he was having an affair with Margaret Chandler, who was married to someone else. And there's a lot of stories about their case. One is that they were both involved in wife swapping and spy work, that he was working for the Russians as a spy and he was murdered, that Margaret Chandler's husband Geoffrey had found out about their affair and had murdered them in a fit of jealousy and rage, and had used this unknown poison to kill them, and their bodies were found naked. Now imagine that, you know, an affair and nudity in the early 60s. So the case still gets investigated even to this day. It's still unsolved. So back to my family. About 2 or 3 months later, there was a knock at the door. It was the police, and they wanted to ask Terry Murray and Harry Murray to come down to the police station for questioning. What had happened was that Bogle and Chandler's bodies were found in Lane Cove National Park, under a bridge, covered in rubbish. The rubbish that my family had dumped there on the sly. The rubbish that my family had dumped there on the sly with their names and addresses on it. Now, oh, doesn't that makes it sound better? But it wasn't. They had become unwitting suspects in a double homicide when all they were wanting to do was be illegal dumpsters. So, until this day, we have a saying in our family, never throw out your rubbish with your personal details on it, because it will lead to identity theft or be used to cover dead bodies. Thank you very much.
Yvette Murray! Yvette Murray, what a story. My brother's here and he'll verify this. In the 60s, when the Sunday newspapers used to come out, the Bogle-Chandler murder was so controversial and so naughty that my parents used to hide the Sunday papers so we couldn't read all about the... So when Yvette told me this story, it just blew me out of the water. Fantastic. Another round of applause for Yvette Murray.